There are stories that haunt you, stories that cling to the edges of your consciousness like shadows in the night. This is one of those stories. A story of a young girl lost to the darkness and the desperate search that followed. It begins on a quiet street in Salt Lake City, in a house that should have been a safe place, on a night that should have been like any other. It was June 5th, 2002, when the nightmare began. The Smart family was asleep in their comfortable home, the kind of home where laughter was common, where love was woven into the very fabric of the walls. 14-year-old Elizabeth slept soundly in her bed, her younger sister Mary beside her. Outside, the night was calm, the city hushed under a blanket of stars. But darkness, true darkness, does not care about peace or safety. It waits, patient and silent, for its moment to strike. Mary woke first. She heard the faint creak of a door, the sound so quiet it could have been the wind. But then she saw him. A figure moving in the shadows, slipping through the doorway, stepping softly on the carpeted floor. Her breath caught in her throat, a scream trapped behind her lips. The man was tall, thin, with wild hair and eyes that gleamed in the dim light. He carried a knife, the blade catching the moonlight in a glint that sent a shiver down her spine. He moved quickly, purposefully, his gaze fixed on Elizabeth. He leaned over her, his breath hot against her ear, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Come with me or I will kill you and your family," he hissed, the knife hovering just inches from her face. Elizabeth's eyes flew open, fear flooding her senses. She did not scream, she did not move. She nodded, a small, terrified nod, and slipped out of bed. Mary lay still, paralyzed by fear, watching as the man led her sister from the room. She heard the whisper of footsteps, the soft click of the door as it closed behind them. For a long moment she lay there, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind spinning with disbelief. And then, with a rush of courage, she ran to her parents' room, her voice breaking the silence of the night. "Elizabeth is gone. Elizabeth is gone." The house erupted into chaos. Lights flicked on, voices rose in panic. The Smarts called the police, their hands trembling, their words frantic and desperate. The hours stretched into the night, the minutes ticking by like a slow, torturous drip. Search parties were formed, neighbors gathered, flashlights flickering like tiny beacons of hope against the oppressive darkness. But Elizabeth was gone, vanished into the night like a wisp of smoke. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and still, there was no sign of her. The media descended like vultures, feeding on the story, turning the quiet neighborhood into a circus of cameras and microphones. Every lead, every clue, every whisper was followed to its end, but they all led to dead ends, to silence, to nothing. And somewhere out there in the vast, sprawling wilderness of Utah, Elizabeth was living a nightmare. She was held captive by a man who called himself Emmanuel, a self-proclaimed prophet, a man whose mind had twisted in on itself, his delusions growing like a cancer. With him was his wife, Wanda Barzee, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a cold smile. Together, they formed a perverse trinity, a family bound not by love, but by madness. Elizabeth was forced to wear a long robe, a veil that covered her face, hiding her identity from the outside world. She was shackled, chained to a tree in a makeshift camp hidden deep within the canyons. The days were filled with fear and confusion, with hunger and thirst, with the constant threat of violence. Emmanuel spoke to her of his visions, his divine mission, his twisted prophecies. He told her she was chosen, that she would be his wife, his servant, that she would bear his children. She was only 14, her childhood ripped away in an instant, replaced by a horror she could barely comprehend. She endured his rants, his delusions, his anger. She listened as he raved about the end of the world, about the enemies that surrounded them, about the sins of the wicked. And she prayed. She prayed for deliverance, for escape, for some sign that her family was still looking for her. In the Smart household, hope began to wither. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Every day brought new pain, new anguish. The police received countless tips, but most were dead ends, wild goose chases that led nowhere. They searched tirelessly through forests, up mountains, into caves, but the girl seemed to have disappeared without a trace. And then, after 9 long months, a miracle, a break in the case. A woman called the police, claiming to have seen a girl in Sandy, Utah, dressed in strange clothing, accompanied by a man and a woman who seemed off. She had seen the girl's eyes, and something in them had seemed familiar, haunting, like she was screaming for help without uttering a word. The police descended upon the scene, their hearts pounding in their chests. They approached cautiously, hands on their weapons, their eyes scanning the crowd. And there she was, Elizabeth, standing between her captors, her face hidden behind a veil, her expression blank, hollow. But those eyes held a spark, a faint glimmer of recognition. They called her name. "Elizabeth, is that you?" For a moment there was silence, and then, slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible, cracking with emotion. "Yes, it's me." Her captors were seized, their hands bound in cuffs, their eyes wide with bewilderment. Emmanuel screamed of injustice, of divine retribution, his voice rising in a fevered pitch. Wanda wept, her shoulders shaking, her hands clutching at the air. But Elizabeth stood still, her eyes locked on the officers, her expression one of quiet relief. She was free. After 9 months of hell, she was finally free. The news spread like wildfire. The nation rejoiced, the headlines blared her name, her face splashed across every screen, every front page. But the nightmare was far from over. Elizabeth returned home to a world that had changed, to a family that had been shattered by grief, by fear, by the endless questions of what could have been done differently. And in the quiet of her room, she tried to sleep. But the darkness held memories, memories of a knife, of a man's breath on her cheek, of whispered threats and cold metal chains. She would close her eyes, and the jungle would return. The camp, the nights spent staring at the stars, wondering if anyone could see her, if anyone knew she was still alive. The nightmares would come, and with them the shadows of that night, the sound of a door creaking open, the whisper of footsteps on the carpet. She would wake with a start, her heart pounding, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. She knew the man was locked away, that he could not hurt her anymore. But fear is a shadow that does not leave so easily. It clings to the corners, it lurks in the hallways, it waits behind every closed door. She had survived. She had escaped. But in many ways, she was still in that room, still hearing that whisper in the dark, still feeling the cold press of the knife against her skin. For Elizabeth, freedom was a fragile thing, a light that flickered in the dark, threatened always by the return of the shadows. She had been stolen from her world, dragged into a nightmare, and though she had emerged, scarred but alive, she would forever carry with her the darkness of that night. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, when the house is still and the world is asleep, she thinks she hears it again. The faint creak of a door, the rustle of fabric in the shadows. And she knows that some horrors never truly end. They just wait, in the dark corners of the mind, ready to emerge when the light begins to fade.